Hey everybody, Ryan here with Darkbolt Films. Want to take some time today to go through my editing process that I used on our latest short film, Night of Terror. So as you can see here, I edited this one in Premiere Pro CC 2014. I've been trying out the Creative Cloud demo. I only have a few days left on there now. Before that, I had been using CS 5.5 for all my editing and post-production stuff. And I still have 5.5, and I'm going to continue using that for the time being while I decide if it's worth it to actually subscribe to Creative Cloud. Most of the main features are the same. There's some obvious visual differences that I've noticed using CC. The biggest thing for me is just the stability and extra performance that CC has over CS 5.5. It seemed a lot more stable. It wasn't as prone to just bog down or even crash out on me, which was really cool. Other than that, it was pretty much the same for me. Getting used to the new interface took a little bit, not long at all. So yeah, I'll be thinking about that here in the next little while to decide whether I want to use CC going forward or if I'm going to stick with CS 5.5 for now. Anyway, so here's my main timeline. By the way, if you haven't watched the film, please go watch that first. The link to that is in the description. It's also on our channel on YouTube. But it's a very short film. I mean, it's just under 5 minutes. So this is the entire thing. We shot it on my iPhone 6 in 1080p, 24 frames per second. I did not use the stock camera app. I used a different one. I'll do a separate video more on the recording with the iPhone stuff. But anyway, our source footage is 1080p at 24 frames per second. So this is this is my main sequence. It's the same settings as our source footage, so it's also 1080p at 24 frames per second. I have our main footage here, a couple different layers of sounds, and then the music score here down at the bottom. So you'll see here I have two title objects that I actually have disabled, and you'll see why that's like that later on. I actually added those on in a later sequence. I started to adopt like a sort of pre-compose workflow within Premiere. That's pretty common for After Effects. I'm not sure how many people do that in Premiere, but I like to do that, where I'll take my sequence, or at least parts of it, put it into a sequence, and then I'll drop that sequence into another sequence, and then add additional things to that, or add additional sequences to it. Like if it's a really complex sequence, I'll make that its own, and then maybe I'll drop that into my main timeline as one object. But in the case of this one, all of my cuts, all of my sound effects, all of my music are all in this one comp, or in this one sequence. So my workflow is pretty standard. I would import all my footage, bring it up in the source monitor, set my ins and outs, and then drag it into my sequence. Once it's there, I typically will kind of go through and tweak my ins and outs maybe even more, do some slight edits to them based on how things are flowing together once I start actually putting multiple clips in. One thing you'll notice here throughout the whole thing is my audio is almost always separate from the video, and then I've expanded it in both directions past where I cut the video, and that is just to blend the audio between cuts. Otherwise, you get really awkward, abrupt changes in background audio, and it really detracts from the project. So I'm not doing anything fancy here. It's really just a fade in, fade out. But adding just that little bit there can make a big difference. So that was one thing I did after I would drop in my main clip. And once I had everything visually cut the way I wanted, I would unlink them, take my audio after it was separate, drag it out, and then add in those fades. There's actually a clip here where I used audio from a separate take mixed with different video because I think he had said something, or so there was some reason we didn't like the audio, but we liked the video of that take. So I took a separate audio, faded it in like before. And if you pay real close attention, it doesn't exactly match up, but there's enough stuff going on visually and with the audio that you're not really noticing that as much. And the main thing is his like scared breathing noise. And then of course the door, I did time it for the door. And then it fades in actually to the next clip into this one. So yeah, the door opening is the last part of the audio that you hear from this one, and then everything going forward is actually the audio from this clip. And that's just what seemed to work for that section. And that's that's a key thing, even if it doesn't make sense or whatever, that doesn't matter as long as it works for your project. We shot this video pretty much in order, in film order. And since it was such a small project, it didn't really hinder us to do that. It wasn't like we were doing things super inefficient doing it that way. There were a few shots that we did out of order. For example, the whole basement sequence, we did that at the very end after we did everything upstairs. And that just made sense to do it that way. But almost everything upstairs was shot in the order that it appears in the film. So when I brought all my footage in, it was basically just finding the take that we liked and then dropping it in. I didn't have to, match up, okay, this was from the beginning of the film, then this next one, that's the end. It was pretty much already in order for me. Another thing that helped with our efficiency, before we started doing any filming or before I even brought out any of the gear, we just walked through the whole house for probably about half an hour and just brainstormed ideas for the different areas of the house. And during that time, I was considering how I would want to frame it on camera, how I would want to block it, where I would want him to walk, where his eye lines are, where the camera's looking at, all that stuff. So once we actually started filming, we had a rough idea in our head of what we wanted to do for each spot, and that made it go a lot faster as well. So I brought all my footage in, got it in the order I wanted, got the rough visual cuts done. Then I went through and started fixing the audio, because that's the next main thing that was messed up. As I was saying, you get those rough, abrupt audio cuts between shots, and it's just really jarring and distracting. So I faded all those through. And then I believe I dropped in the sound effects next. And we had a few things that we went around and recorded our own Foley sounds. So one of these, or actually a couple, were like cabinets closing. So I added those on top. When we shot it, we actually just used a finger click to signal that sound, so he had something to act against. And then we just dropped in that sound effect on top. And then the other big ones we had was the large crash from the basement. And for that one, we actually didn't have any trigger while we were shooting. It was just him acting, and then when he felt like it, he imagined a loud boom, and then he screamed. I thought he did a really good job with that. But then afterwards, I just brought in my crash sound effect, timed it to where I thought would make sense with a reasonable reaction time for him, and then dropped it in front of his scream. And that was it. And then, of course, with this particular one, I tied in the music with that as well. Got a nice build up coming up to it, and then it drops out just to the low bass tone again. So it's all working together to add and build tension, and then release it after the crash. And then the final sound effects were just a few knocks on a door. Nothing fancy there. Additionally, I have 3 shots that are linked to After Effects comps. 2 of those are just stabilization. So it was, a bit of a shaky shot, and I just wanted it to be more smooth in the final. One thing that's really nice about the Adobe Creative Suite products, or the CC, is the dynamic link between Premiere and After Effects. That is an awesome thing. I worked for a while with After Effects 6 and then some other third-party video editor, and it worked, but it was definitely a pain to have to find the sequence that I wanted to add an effect on, export that sequence as some file. I wanted to maintain as much quality as possible, so usually that was a large file. Drop that over into After Effects, add my effects to it, re-export again as high as quality as possible, and then drop that back into my video editor. Just a big pain, and this makes it so much easier. You just right click on it, replace with After Effects composition, bam, shows up in After Effects. Do what you want to it, and then your changes are automatically reflected in your Premiere sequence. One downside to that is it's generally not going to play back in real time, which can be a pain if it's a key part of your sequence and you're trying to review the whole sequence as a whole to get your flow and everything. So once in a while you have to do, render out that section or render out the work area so you can play that back in a reasonable manner. So yeah, here's one of those shots that I had put the stabilization on. This was basically just a handheld shot, but I wanted it to look like a tripod. So I go ahead and I put that in After Effects and just switch that to no motion and let that process, and that worked out really well. The next one is, again, another stabilization. This is one of the bigger moving shots within the film. It pulls back from the TV kind of over his shoulder, and then, still looking at the TV the whole time. That was a trickier shot to do because I obviously don't have any sort of crane or anything in my house. I don't have any proper dolly or anything like that. And as you can see in this shot here, because it hasn't updated yet, my living room isn't real big, so I didn't have a whole lot of room to move past him or past the couch to get that shot. So I had to walk with the phone on my mount, walk past him, and keep the camera as steady as possible. So yeah, for this shot, I just dropped it over into After Effects and then performed just a stabilized motion on there, and that really cleaned up the shot nicely. Okay, and then the third After Effects comp is basically the only actual effects shot in the short film. For this one thing that made it a lot quicker to work on is this is all one take here. And typically in the past, when I would have a shot like that, I would just select the whole clip and send it over into After Effects. And that works fine, but it's a much larger piece of video that it's trying to sync up all the time. And really, I might only be applying an effect to a small part of that. So for this one, I went ahead and trimmed the part that needed the effect in Premiere here. Made that its own clip, even though it's all part of the same take visually. And then I just dropped this particular section over into After Effects, and that made it a lot smaller and faster to work with. And it worked out a lot better, so I'm definitely going to be doing that moving forward. So there's a couple things going on in this shot. When we shot it, we didn't really know for sure what we wanted to do visually. We just knew there'd be something on his face or something mess up with his face that would cause him to be very scared. So basically that's what he had to go on as far as acting. And then afterwards I would go in and put in something. Decided to go with this kind of look. So the first thing I did is I motion tracked the eyes, and then attached that to these null objects here. And the purpose of that was just to give me basically like a fixed platform that I could attach something to on top of his eyes, instead of having to manually keyframe something to make it stay on his eye. And that was the only thing. I mean, I still had to do keyframing for the black objects to make those look proper. But having that track to null there made it easier. I wasn't dragging it around each frame so it would stay on his eye. I was adjusting the shape each frame so that it matched his eye. It was already stuck on his eye thanks to that track. So yeah, after the eyes were tracked and the nulls were attached, I believe I went through and actually fixed a few of the keyframes for the nulls. Like there were a few frames where the track just lost his eye a little bit. So I went through and manually fixed those so that they basically stay on the center or the edge of his pupil there. And then I went through and added the eyes one by one. And this is just a black solid with a elliptical mask, and then adjusting the mask shape each frame to match the shape of his eye for that particular frame. And then these were parented to that null again, so as the eyes moved, the solid stayed attached to the null, and then I just had to adjust the shape. So it took a little bit, but not not terrible, and it definitely accomplished the look that we were looking for. And then the final thing that I did to make it just a little more visually scary, I guess, or visually different, was actually something really simple. Just adjustment layer on top, again with a mask, and then this is just a hue and saturation effect, and I just pulled a lot of the saturation out. So the toughest part of this was just the beginning and end. So here I had to mask out his head in the foreground, so that we weren't getting this desaturation effect on top of him here. And then just keyframe that so that it's revealed as his head pulls away. And then, of course, just matching this with his face throughout the motion. And I also had another mask down here so that it was only showing in the mirror. So, really simple stuff. And then once he's away from the mirror, I didn't even bother adjusting that mask anymore. It just kind of floats on its own because it's not needed. Don't do more than you need to. Same thing with the head mask. As soon as they are no longer needed, it goes away. And actually, just for these, I adjusted the opacity of them. So once it had served its purpose, drop the opacity to 0, and then ignore it. And for this one, for most of it, I went through and keyframed about every 2 frames. There was a few where his motion just required me to do each frame, but for the most part, I was able to get away with every other frame. And then the turning of the head, that was a little more detailed. That had to be done individually. But yeah, just a desaturation mask. Some slight feathering on the edges. And that's it. Then it's done. And that's it as far as actual After Effects work. I also did some color correction to most of the clips in here just to, one, try to keep a consistent look throughout the film, and 2, to add a little visual interest and have it fit the tone that I was looking for. So even if you look at this initial shot here, if I can kind of get these close, not sure if you can see the color difference between this one and this one. There's not a whole lot that I'm doing to it here. Just some slight color balance changes for that clip. And this was something I had to do different for each one, depending on what was needed. So like this one brought out some greens. This one, again, greens. This was actually a little more. But it really varied based on the shot. This one I didn't do any color changes, but I did adjust the brightness and contrast due to this really bright hall light that I didn't really have a way to get around. Without it, it was just super dark. With it, it was unfortunately super bright. If I would have had a dimmer bulb to put in there, I would have probably tried that, but this was all sort of a last minute thing on a Saturday night. Hey, let's make a movie. So I didn't have any, if I had a little more preparation, that would probably be one of the things that I had changed, because that light caused problems for me in other shots as well. This one, I used a fast color corrector. Just some slight changes there to, again, match the color tone to other shots. Here's another shot that unfortunately kind of got blown out due to that hall light again. This was also a difficult shot. It was one of the longest, single shots in the film. I mean, there's 3 long ones here. One is the intro, and that's just a slow walk through the kitchen all the way up to him on the couch. The next is the biggest dialogue scene in the film, just him on the phone. Not a whole lot of camera movement there. Just some slight back and forth to add a little interest to it. But the longest one is this one right here. And it goes through a few different lighting setups. So yeah, unfortunately that hall light caused me some issues. And then for this shot, since it was a shorter one, and he didn't go into other lighting areas really, I exposed this one a little better for that ceiling light, so it's not as harsh. But even this one, you get a pretty bright lighting thing from that hall light. Didn't really do any color correction to the basement shots. I was fairly happy with their look as is. If anything, maybe I would have tweaked this one a bit. But it wasn't too bad as it was. I really liked the way the stairs looked, especially this top part here with the door. So this is ungraded right off the iPhone. And at the end, of course, we have title, some credits, and then just stuck a little thing at the end here. This was actually a continuation of this shot. And we knew we were going to cut this shot, and we were going to have a close-up of him actually opening the door. So he decided to just have some fun with it, I guess.
It's empty! Oh my god, it's empty! Yes! Nothing there! Wow!
And I thought we had to put that in there somewhere, so I stuck that in at the end after some nice black space. Okay, so once I had my main sequence here all set, I had all my clips in order, all my cuts, all the audio, all the music, the credits at the end. I dumped that into another sequence called Main Wide. With this film, I was toying around with putting it in basically anamorphic widescreen, 2.4 to 1, or however you want to classify that one. And I was kind of on the fence, like, I don't know if I want to do it super wide or if I want it just, full standard 16:9. But I dropped it into this one, and basically for this, all I did is I made a new sequence, the same 24 frames per second, but I switched the resolution to 1920 by 800. So that puts it right around, the 2.4 to 1 ratio. And then I took my main sequence from the project, drop that into this new comp, and that automatically is going to, cut off part of the frame. So with that, I was able to adjust my framing a little bit if I wanted. So like for this one, actually for most of the shots, just putting it in this aspect ratio was enough. I didn't have to reframe it. It worked pretty well as it was. But there was a few that I felt I wanted to move up or down to fit into that wider aspect ratio. So like this one I adjusted just a little bit. This one I adjusted a little bit to keep his face and eyes where I wanted. This one again shifted just a little bit. But that's one cool thing about deciding to use that aspect ratio in addition to just the look and feel that it adds, because it does change the feel of it. I feel that it does change that because it's focusing the viewer in a different way than full 16:9 ratio does. But that's all just preference, and do whatever you want. If you knew you're going to be working exclusively in the wider aspect ratio, I would just make your main sequence that resolution, and then just drop your clips directly in there and work with them that way. With mine, as I said, I was kind of on the fence for a while, so the main comp I did in regular 16:9 aspect ratio. And that way I could go either way with it afterwards. So for a while I was actually, comparing a 16:9 and a 2.4:1 view, basically side by side, just seeing which one I liked better. Ended up going with the 2.4. If I would have known that, I would have just worked directly in that from the start. But not a big deal. So the only cuts that I'm doing here, that just matches up with basically the clips in the main sequence, and that was just so I could adjust their position without affecting other ones. I could have keyframed it and just left it all as one clip. But to me, it was easier just to trim the clips and then just adjust their position once and then have that stay for the entire length of that clip. So once I was done with the main wide sequence here, drop that into a final sequence. This one is actually back up to full 16:9 resolution. So this adds the crop bars on it visually. And then I also added my titles. The reason I added them on at last is because I also had a full res version. So I was comparing those, side by side to decide which one I wanted, and that the difference in frame adjusted where I wanted to place my title. So I decided to actually add those in that sequence instead. So yeah, this is basically my final sequence then. And then this was what I exported to YouTube, and then anything else that I would want to save this out to a disk or whatever. And of course on the end here we have Turbo Films. So basically 3 steps in my editing process for this particular film. So I had the main comp. I keep saying comp. That's After Effects. So I had the main sequence, had all my clips, had all the cuts, all of the audio and music is in this one. In this particular project, I had a additional sequence to put it into a 2.4 aspect ratio. That's basically the only purpose of this sequence. Again, if I had decided that I was going to be using this aspect ratio exclusively from the get-go, I would have just worked in this first. And then we have the final sequence, which basically just adds in the titles on top of the cropped footage, and then it has the logo. So that's basically the entire thing. Not much to it. You can look over here how I grouped my objects. Footage all in one bin. My After Effects linked comps. My actual sequences. Titles. Any sound effects. And then the music. It's not a whole lot, but it's definitely a fun project to work on. And it was nice to use Premiere CC. Again, for the most part, it was basically the same process and everything as using CS 5.5. There's a few new features that I found useful, but nothing drastic, nothing that I couldn't live without. I think the biggest thing for me was just the performance and stability increase over CS 5.5. And, again, this was a really small project, so I wasn't taxing the system too bad. But it's also full 1080p. A lot of my previous projects were 720 or, even lower. And video resolutions are only going up. So that extra stability is definitely a good positive. So I think that'll about do it for this video. If you have any questions on anything that you saw or would like me to elaborate on anything, just let me know. Put in a comment or shoot me an email or something. Other than that, I'll catch you all next time.